Delba, how are you?
Hi, I'm okay. How are you doing?
Doing well. I'm excited to have you on today and chat about some things about Next.js and GraphCMS. But I got a little bit ahead of myself because I was excited to talk to you. And so first I'll introduce myself. My name's Emily. I'm the content marketing manager here at GraphCMS. And I'm really excited to talk to you. Maybe you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi. My name is Delba, and I work as a developer advocate for Next.js and Vercel. And I'm here today to talk about how we can combine GraphCMS with Next.js.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so like you mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to combine GraphCMS and Next.js and also kind of talking about it in the abstract, but then breaking it down based on some use cases that we notice a lot with our users and kind of all of the different things that you can build. So, you ready to get into it?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. So I think first it's probably helpful to talk about kind of what GraphCMS and what Next.js are, just because, if you're new, maybe you've never heard of GraphCMS before. So just a quick overview. GraphCMS is a GraphQL native headless CMS, which kind of enables teams to either build performant platforms, websites, content platforms, content hubs. What that essentially means is that it's a way to organize and host structured content for the front end of your choice or multiple front ends. It's kind of up to you. We try to handle all of the back end that you need to have so that you're able to have a lot of fun working with the front end, which maybe you want to give a little intro on Next.js as well?
Yeah, of course. So Next.js is a React framework that helps us build front-end applications. And we tend to say that Next.js is helpful for building production-ready applications. And by that, we mean applications that are used, in the real world with a lot of traffic. And Next.js can also combine with any backend of your choice, including GraphCMS. Now, Vercel, the team behind Next.js, is a hosting platform for front-end applications. So our aim at Vercel is to make sure that we remove the complexity and also the tooling and all the things that are required to deploy and scale your websites so that developers can focus on building the websites themselves and shipping features rather than the tooling and configuration that comes with the deployment itself. So that's kind of a brief introduction of Next.js and Vercel and how they work together as well.
That is really exciting. And I am excited to learn a little bit more about Next.js. I mean, we were talking before that we kind of both live in our own worlds in terms of back end versus front end. And so I'm definitely excited to take a closer look at Next.js and see how they all work together with GraphCMS as well. And so maybe we want to just go ahead and dive into it. I've pulled up the GraphCMS website to just kind of help give a little bit more of a visual representation because a lot of what we talk about in content can be very abstract. And so sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of a visual, especially when talking about content. So to kind of kick it off with GraphCMS to begin, you are first going to create a schema and models for your content, which will then work, which you'll be able to query from the API. But so what does that mean exactly? So within a content model, it's basically all of the different little bits of data that you want to pull together. And you can use relations to kind of show different relationships between different types of content, content models. So here on the example, you see that there's a show model, there's an episode model, and there's an actor model. And these will all have their own different pieces of data associated with their larger model, which then can be connected via relations to build out a really nice kind of organized way of thinking about structured content. And from there, you're able to use the GraphQL playground or the GraphQL Explorer in GraphCMS to use all of this data that's been modeled here in an actual API. So if you're a content editor, you might be working directly with the UI, whereas if you're a developer, you'll be working largely with the API, which provides like a really nice experience for both folks. So whoever you're following along with. Yeah, and then from here you'll be starting to work with Next.js a little bit, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So you mentioned that GraphCMS provides an API, and as developers, what we can do is we can use that API to fetch our GraphCMS data. So Next.js actually provides different data fetching methods that allows us to choose when or where we fetch our data. Like, for example, we can have client-side rendering to fetch our data in the browser when SEO isn't much of a concern, or we can use server-side rendering to fetch data on the server when SEO is important and we need to make sure that our content gets delivered to our user our dynamic content gets delivered to our user. And then we can also use static generation to fetch the data from GraphCMS and then store it in CDNs. So CDNs are servers that store static content like HTML and images. So we can fetch the data from GraphCML and store it in CDNs across the world, which makes it fast because then the content is placed close to our users, and which means that when they request the content or when they visit our website, they will get that content served to them immediately. Now, when we make changes to our GraphCMS API, we can then those, if I'm understanding correctly, those changes get reflected immediately in the API,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly. So whenever you're making changes, which we call usually GraphQL, if we're doing it programmatically, then we can do it via GraphQL mutations. And so you'll see here, this is one of the queries that you can use if you've noticed that you've misspelled something and you want to handle that programmatically. Then you'll get this updated, and if you put it into the CMS afterwards, you would get a updated version of it, which is really amazing. It's very cool and can really help kind of move things along quickly. And so then once you have it updated in the GraphQL API, what happens with Next.js with that?
Yeah, so after you make the change in your API, you want to choose whichever data fetching method is more appropriate for your content. Because then you have to set how often or where that data gets fetched. Now, the data fetching method that you would choose would highly depend on whether your content is more dynamic or static. And I think before we move on to our examples, it would be nice for us to just clarify what those two things are. So,
Yeah.
when we say static content, we mean content that doesn't change very often and is usually the same for all our users. So, for example, marketing pages or articles, they tend to be the same for the users that visit our page. And by dynamic content, what we mean is content that changes more often and more frequently and is usually personalized for the users themselves. So, like, for example, user profiles or dashboards and other things. Content that changes very often is what we would say is more dynamic. So, depending on whether you're personalizing your content for a particular user in GraphCMS, which from my understanding, you can also have uh, user models, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
authors and things like that. So with GraphCMS, you can see whether you're updating your content more often or not, depending on your models and your content needs. So you can decide whether that content is actually going to be more static or more dynamic.
Yeah, and while you can't actually handle personalization within GraphCMS, what you can do is you can use API extensions to be able to pull in an actual personalization tool, which specializes in personalization, so that you have kind of the personalization tool of your choice that's able to kind of work with the content models that are existing within GraphCMS to help build that kind of personalized journey.
Cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very cool. And so I think one thing that's really helpful is to also think about it in a more concrete context, right? So we've been talking about it as a very broad way of how all of this stuff works together, but what are some use cases that actually can work together with GraphCMS and Next.js really well? And we kind of talked about mentioning content-heavy sites or something like a news site, and then also diving into e-commerce sites. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, that sounds great. I think those are very good examples for us to discuss how you would build something with GraphCMS and Next.js.
Definitely.
So
And it's
which one do you want to start with? Sorry.
I think let's start with content-heavy sites because I think that's a better way to kind of get your toes wet and see a little bit more about how these all work together. And then something a little bit more complex like e-commerce, we can take a little bit more time.
Mhm. Awesome.
Cool.
Cool.
So what we mean by content-heavy sites are kind of mostly static sites that they tend to be the same for all users. There's not as much personalization, correct?
Yes, that's right. So with static sites, especially ones that have articles or blog posts, that content tends to be mostly static because it doesn't change very often. And you might just want to personalize it when it comes to localization, but if not, then it's completely static. And also with content heavy sites, especially news sites, updates tend to occur very often. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if you're a news site and you have a breaking news story, you might want to change your content as that story develops. So we actually have two conflicting ideas here where we want to deliver fast static content to our users, no matter where they are in the world. But we also need to make sure that we update that content depending on our needs. That could be, every 1 minute or once a day. So we need to figure out how we actually update the content for our sites.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I would be curious to know how updating content happens in GraphCMS, if you don't mind sharing.
Absolutely. So, kind of what you're talking about goes a lot into the way that the content is modeled in GraphCMS. There we go. And so, content modeling is it's important for a couple of different reasons. So, you might have some content that's modeled in a way that it's going to be kind of a longer a piece of content that's not going to change very often. So, for example, like an author's name, that's going to be a type of content that you really would probably only change if they change their Twitter handle or something like that. Whereas other types of content, like you mentioned, with an actual post or something like that, will change more frequently based off of kind of how how the story develops or if there's any kind of updates that people want to create. So there are a couple of things that are really great about that. I mean, within GraphCMS, we have content versioning, which means that you can have an existing content piece live while also making updates to it and then push those changes live as well without disrupting your existing version until it's finally updated, which means you don't have any time that that piece of content just disappears or something like that. Content can also be updated programmatically. So, like we talked about a little bit with the GraphQL mutations, that kind of stuff can also occur on a larger scale. Um, yeah, and finally, I would say one thing that we're really excited about at GraphCMS is we're releasing scheduled publishing. So something like a story that's been developing over a longer period of time and that has already gone through QA and everything like that, and it's going to be released on the 10th of November, then you can go ahead and have that scheduled and it'll be set live without having to do it manually. So reducing more of that manual friction. Um, yeah, it's definitely really cool. So with kind of finding the balance depending on what what type of content you're creating and how it's modeled and um, being able to use the functionality that helps you build the workflow that you need. So whether or not you're a developer or a content editor, there's slightly different tools that will help you there.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I
And what
I do.
about with, yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
sorry, go on.
Sorry.
I was just about to say I do like the idea of scheduling, and I think that would work perfectly with Next.js as well, just because of how you can set up your data fetching to make sure that you pull the data from GraphCMS. So, sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of talk to you about how this works with the different types of data fetching with Next.js. I'm curious to learn more about that.
Yeah. So we talked about how for these types of websites, we want our content to be more static because if it's static, that means that we can deliver it fast to our users. So as I mentioned before, we can statically generate the content ahead of time and then cache it in CDNs around the world. However, there is a problem with caching, which is, the content doesn't get updated when we want it to update. Next.js has a feature called incremental static regeneration that allows us to set a timed interval for when we want our cache data to be refreshed or the page to be regenerated. So, for example, you can set it to be 5 seconds if you want your content to update fast, or you can set it to a minute or even a day, depending on your needs. Now, when you mentioned scheduling, I actually thought that this would be a great idea because what you can do is you can schedule your content to be, published, and then you don't have to worry about refreshing the data in Next.js if you have incremental static regeneration, because then when the times come, Next.js will refetch that data and update it. So I I really like the idea of also being able to like pull other static data as well from GraphCMS, like you mentioned, the authors. That information doesn't change or won't change very often. So that's definitely something that we can also handle with Next.js in static site generation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It also, for some reason, makes me think of if you think about like a comment section on a website, with GraphCMS, I know that using API extensions, or with GraphQL mutations, you're able to go in and update that people have made a comment or something like that. How would you know what type of fetching to use in that kind of user-generated content use case?
Yeah, I think it really does depend um, on your traffic and how often users visit your page. So since Next.js allows you to fetch data on the page level, if you have a comment section below on the same page, static generation might not work for the comment section itself. However, you can lean into things like client-side data fetching for specific components within your page. So if you want to update your comments as they come in and re-render the comment component, you can make use of libraries like use SWR or even React's own native like use effect to fetch the data as it shows on the page.
That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Very cool.
Sorry, not fetch, mutate and then publish
Okay.
and yeah.
Yeah. That okay. I was
Yeah.
like, I'm missing something, but okay.
Yeah, me too.
I see, I see. Yeah. No, I think that kind of gets us into a good time to start maybe talking about, security and what goes into keeping, your workflows the way that they should be, and ensuring that, especially with kind of a high traffic news site, you're going to have a lot of different people who are working with the various systems. And so from a content side, at GraphCMS, we also offer granular roles and permissions, which basically means that, you know different people within the CMS have different permission systems. So there are some people who will just be able to write content into the CMS. There are some people who could edit content into the CMS, and then there are some people who have the actual publishing rights. This is really actually highly granular, and so we also have normal system options where it's all of these are figured out for you. But, if you're working in a sophisticated organization where you want more of this kind of fine grained approach, then you're able to kind of create these permissions for yourself. And you can see an example here of permissions for the admin. They have, all of the permissions as the admin, but you can also have someone as like just a content editor, or thinking about it from like a localization perspective of someone who should just go in and be able to check the content and then publish it or something like that. So that's one way that we try and keep, data secure, and also making sure that not everybody can see all of the other data that people are writing in, depending on the permissions that you choose. How do you guys handle um, making sure that your sites are secure?
Yeah. So I love this feature, by the way, just because it removes away the complexity of setting up authentication in the front end, and you can just handle everything from GraphCMS or your, in this case, we like the backend for who can access and edit your content. With Next.js, what we can do to make sure that we add an extra layer of security is Next.js provides API routes, and you can, regardless of the data fetching method you can use API routes to protect your sensitive API information, like your token, for example. And this prevents third parties from mutating your data, um, since there is a problem of fetching data using your API on the client. So you can make sure that you protect that sensitive information by using Next.js API routes, so that no one malicious, I would say, would be able to access your API. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important element of it for sure. And I know GraphCMS also has all of the tokens that you need to kind of keep all of that stuff secure and make sure that only people who should have access to this sensitive information. So it's a very, very good point for sure. Very cool. And kind of another thing that's important with, thinking about content heavy sites is also the idea for, we've talked about how some of the content might need to be static, some of it might need to be dynamic. Things are changing all the time. So um, you kind of have to have a little bit more flexibility within the way that you've structured content. And in general, the site that you're building today might not be the site that you're going to build in a couple of months or something like that. So um, maybe let's talk a little bit about flexibility and how Next.js and GraphCMS help out making sure that your stack stays flexible.
Yeah, yeah, for
Cool.
sure. So
Very cool.
with with Next.js, like going back to incremental static regeneration, if you have like a site that's very big with many articles and a lot of static content, you want to make sure that you're not having to regenerate, your hundreds of thousands of pages every single time. One of the things that you can do is you can regenerate pages that are new or most recent and most visited. And then you can use a feature in Next.js called fallback blocking, to ensure that the older pages, like let's say from, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago, because some news websites do keep like older articles in their website, you can make
Of
sure that
course.
that page only gets regenerated when the user visits it. So there is flexibility in the way that you fetch your data, to make sure that your site is still performant. So just to kind of like summarize what I was saying is you can choose which pages to regenerate depending on your traffic.
That's really helpful. And I mean, if you think about a lot of use cases that are performing at scale, I mean, there's going to be so many different types of content. And so being able to have that flexibility and decide when things should be rendered and when things should be fetched and all of that sort of stuff, and making that not only just on a whole website level, but breaking it down to these specific pages is really, really helpful.
Yeah, yeah, it is. What about GraphCMS? How can you add flexibility and scale?
Yeah, definitely. So with GraphCMS, a lot of the flexibility is built into, again, the way that you build the content models. And the content models and relations kind of allow the team to build a schema that's make sure that content is always easy to update and optimize. So if teams are trying to um, be a little bit more experimental and want to try to build a new page quickly, they're able to do that by building a new content model and filling in content that can populate that page or whatever kind of modal or whatever it is the final end product is going to be, and then pull in content using relations from existing spaces so they don't have to reinvent the wheel, which kind of allows teams to be able to be a little bit more experimental, a little bit more flexible, so that if they want to try, you know, for example, building a newsletter that's a thematic newsletter. So we've been going through all of the COVID stuff. So if you wanted to deal with a page that is specifically all about COVID, um, stories in relations to COVID, you'd be able to do that with GraphCMS using the relations and using this kind of flexible content modeling. And instead of it taking a really long time, because a lot of that stuff is already existing, you can just kind of flexibly, quickly create a new page and see it kind of come to action pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think one thing I would add to that as well is being able to leverage GraphQL as a query language as well, because GraphQL allows you to build your query and then get the data in the exact shape that you want.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we're very limited by the data that we get back from our API, and we might have to kind of like reorganize that data in the front end in order to display it. Whereas with GraphCMS and GraphQL, you can write down how you want to query your database and then get that information so that it's easier to display it in the front end. So I think that's like one of the biggest selling points of GraphCMS is the ability to, use GraphQL, which is a very popular language for querying databases.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you see all the time about performance benefits of GraphQL and how much it helps kind of expedite building new projects and all of that kind of stuff while still having an API that can perform at scale. And so it's really nice to see that those things do actually hold up. Based off of our users, we've definitely seen that's the case. And, I think one of the things to think about, especially with a news or a content heavy site, is again going to be this idea that, it could be a um, global news source or something like that, where you're going to have people reading it from all over the world. And one of these considerations should also be localization and making sure that content is accessible across locales. Um, and so, how does Next.js handle localization?
Yeah, so Next.js actually has built-in support for internationalized routing, and what that means is we can provide a list of locales to Next.js, and Next.js will automatically handle the routing. So, oh, you have the page up. If you could scroll down a little
Yeah,
bit
of
and just
course.
show our example, um, as you can see, we can give Next.js a list of locales. So we have English US, FR now, and then Next.js will figure out how to handle the routing based on the user's language. Now, more recently, as well with middleware, what we can do is we can handle the redirects or the routing at the edge based on the user's location. So we can check the user's location using middleware and then handle the routing for there. And that takes some of the burden away, from what the things that we were doing before in the client side and also on the server. And we actually have an example of this on the Vercel Edge Functions page.
Yeah,
That one, yeah. If you scroll down,
of
we
course.
have a vast list of examples of things that you can do with Edge functions and middleware, and one of them is internationalization. So if people want to check it out, there's an example of how they can get started with it.
It's very cool. I'm excited to talk more about the edge later on in our conversation, but it's amazing to see all of the different functionality that's available that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. So what about GraphCMS? How does it handle localization?
Yeah, so GraphCMS makes it super easy to localize your content. Within GraphCMS, if you enable localization, you choose which locales you would like to enable, and then your UI shows up like this. And so you'll have the different um, text fields that you're able to implement localization in. From a API perspective, it also shows up quite nicely if you see which kind of uh, you see the content in the various localizations as well. And so you see, here's the response as well with content localization and in-house Lokalisierung. Um, and so with GraphCMS, it's super easy to have locale-based publishing and enabling kind of teams to create content for the international audience that way via the UI, if that's the way that you're doing it, if you're having different folks going in and putting in content within the GraphCMS UI. Again, you can use the fine-grained permission system to make sure that they have the right amount of power within the CMS. Or you can do it programmatically if you're getting all of that data externally already and just want to be able to migrate it into the CMS. You can do that programmatically via GraphQL mutation so that you don't have to go and input all of the content if you have it, on a larger scale.
Awesome. That's really great. I do love all the different fields, and I think that's a very cool feature of GraphCMS, the ability to just personalize your content and change the language as well.
Yeah, it makes it super useful, for to make content more accessible for a wider audience, and I think that's such an important element of thinking about building for the kind of global community.
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool. Awesome. Now, another thing I guess we haven't talked about is SEO, because for news sites and content-heavy sites, SEO is very important.
Of
Um,
course.
so I guess I would love to hear from your perspective how GraphCMS helps, especially because you work in marketing, right? So you're very used to SEO and how to write the metadata for it. So yeah, how can we do that with GraphCMS?
Yeah, exactly. So again, this goes back to content modeling. The way that we handle our SEO on our GraphCMS blog, which is built with GraphCMS and Next.js, is by having an extra SEO content model, which allows us to, input our title, our metadata, our keywords that we're searching for, all of these kind of things, and have that easily organized there. Um, Having this kind of structured data makes it really easy for crawlers and that sort of thing to be able to find you. And also just the very nature of it being super easy to update content and be able to kind of iterate as you go along, to keep your content up to date, to make sure that if something's not doing well, that it's easy to update rather than having to, go ask a developer to make these changes or something like that. If you think about the way it was done previously, um, it has, there's just a lot of little elements of it that make GraphCMS really SEO friendly. And I'd love to hear, I'm sure with all of the static site rendering and all of in that element of Next.js that you guys do a great job with that as well.
Yeah, yeah. So static generation and server-side rendering really does help with that. The kind of like umbrella term for it is pre-rendering. So the way that React applications traditionally work is that all the information and all the code to build your application is sent to the browser with client-side rendering, and then the browser does the work of building out the pages and fetching the data and outputting the final content. Now, this is a problem for web crawlers because when they initially go into like a page, they will just see like a blank HTML shell with no content. So they have to do the rendering work on their side to understand what's in the page so that they can understand how to rank that particular page. Now, with pre-rendering in Next.js, you can do all that work on the server, so you can fetch your data from GraphCMS, and then you can run your application code and then output the final HTML of the page with all your content. And that helps the crawlers because immediately after they visit the page, they know what content to expect inside the page. So that's how a little bit of how pre-rendering kind of helps with SEO and rankings by enabling developers to pre-render the page.
Yeah, I mean, that's all. I think all of that sounds really helpful to people who are, I mean, performance is a key element, and making sure that your site can be found is so important. And so all of these elements of SEO, just doing everything you can for them is just, it's so critical.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. And you do like if you have a business, especially like a content heavy business, you do want to make sure that your rankings in Google are good because that's how you would probably get a lot of your traffic coming in.
Mm.
Um, on that note, we have released an SEO course that people can find on our Next.js website. So SEO is, I would say, a universe of itself. So if anyone's like more interested in learning about SEO and how to make sure that they can build applications with Next.js that have good SEO and also that have good core web vitals. Are you familiar with core web vitals?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we do talk about core web vitals as well. And for our audience who's watching us, core web vitals is how Google measures I guess, the health of a web page, and
Mm.
they do have an impact on SEO. So you want to make sure that you create applications that are not just performant, but also that don't compromise the user experience. So core web vitals measure that the how our users are experience our websites.
Yeah. I mean, those are so important, and I feel like as soon as you work in marketing for just a moment, you're spending a lot of time looking at core web vitals and all of the Google information that comes out of analytics. Um, but definitely that the tutorial from Next.js is a really key thing to think about. So thanks for sharing that. And we'll make sure to put the link to that as well in the description of the video so that people can find it pretty easily.
Awesome, thank you.
Do you have any final thoughts on the content heavy use case and anything
Mm,
else that we should cover?
yeah. There was one more thing that we could talk about, which is advertisement, because a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
websites, they rely on advertising for income. Um, with ads, you want to make sure that they don't impact the user experience. And Next.js gives us a script component, and basically what we can do with the script component is we can set a loading priority for external scripts like ad scripts. So that way you can load your page content first and make sure that your user can see your content. And then you can set the ads to load after your content has loaded so that they don't interfere with the page load. And again, affecting so that it doesn't affect your core web vitals and things like that. So for advertising, the script component would be very helpful as well if your site relies um, on on advertisement itself. I apologize. I just have to cough.
No worries. Yeah. I think that's one of the coolest things about front end world in general is there's just so many of these little optimizations that you can make that do make a big impact on performance and really do make a big impact, especially on user experience. I mean, we spend so much of our lives online now that like you definitely notice when there's a website that's annoying the way that it's loading or if the advertisements load first or those kind of things. Like I think Next.js does a really good job of thinking about the user and the user experience at its core and making sure that, they're always creating little ways to optimize and make sure that that user experience is always tip top.
It's in the details.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Definitely.
Mhm.
Definitely. Okay, so let's dive into now that we've kind of, I think with the content heavy sites, we've kind of covered the basics in a lot of ways of how to understand how GraphCMS and Next.js work and how when you are using them in tandem, you're able to see some performance benefits. You're able to have more flexibility and create localized content. So let's think about it in a little bit more of a complex use case, which might be an e-commerce site. So, e-commerce sites or e-commerce applications, they're complex, they're data heavy. You might be, having hundreds of thousands of product pages or bringing in data from multiple systems. And, kind of what are some of the things that you think as a user are most important when you're thinking about working with the e-commerce site?
Yeah. Yes, I definitely agree with you that they're, a lot more complex. And when we're, designing these sites, I think there are three main things we need to keep in mind. The first one is speed. We want to make sure that the content loads fast for our user and that it provides a good user experience because that impacts conversion. There's a saying that not to name any any businesses, but for very large businesses with lots of products and users, if there is latency, even like 100 milliseconds can cause a drop in conversions or a drop in sales. So speed is very important, especially as you scale and you grow your e-commerce sites. The other thing as well is if you have a international e-commerce site, like a multi-country one, you want to make sure that you're localizing the information that you serve to your customers, like the language, the price, the currency, and everything else. And then the third thing is you probably also want to run tests to identify what variation of your content performs best. So you might run a few tests on products or pages to make sure that, again, you're driving conversions and you're driving sales of your e-commerce site. So I guess that would be like the main three things that we need to think about when we're doing e-commerce sites as developers. Which is there's also a fourth one, I would say, which is
Okay.
authentication,
Yeah.
and handling payments, but let's not go too deep into this because I think this is more to do with with payment systems and not so much with the management of the data itself.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of a good segue into talking about how to build systems at scale. And so, especially thinking about the data and the content, one of the things that GraphCMS does is because it is so flexible, depending on the implementation, people can use it in a lot of different ways for an e-commerce setup. Um, 1 second, I will pull up, believe this. So one of the things that's really cool about GraphCMS is if you are having a couple of different systems that are all working in tandem, um, you might have, a PIM, a payment system, and a, content CMS as well, which are able to work together to kind of create a final nice smooth product interface. So what I've just pulled up is actually an example that we have at GraphCMS, which is an e-commerce starter. So it starts from a template within GraphCMS and works with Next.js and Stripe to be able to build a final kind of simple e-commerce store, but it looks and feels like kind of what we expect. And so with API extensions, GraphCMS is able to bring together content and information into GraphCMS from external systems, aggregating all of that content into a single place. And so to kind of give you a visual of what that would look like. So you have all of the content which is stored in GraphCMS, and then you'll have something like a remote API call that'll bring in more content and be able to organize it and then push it to its various front ends, depending on kind of what use case you're in, or specifically working with the commerce and use case as well. So it really helps to keep that performance up, make sure that the best of breed systems are allowing people to choose the systems that are best suited for their use case, but still have the benefit of aggregating into a single API, which is easier to talk with the front end with for.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very cool feature, as you mentioned, aggregating your data into one place. From a developer perspective, we don't want to be fetching data in applications from multiple places, because every time we fetch data, we have to kind of design how we're going to display that data and everything related to it. So if we have something like GraphQL where we can manipulate our queries and we have only one API, that makes our jobs easier because then we can just pull data from one single source. So I do like the idea of GraphCMS being able to just aggregate all your data in one place. I'll be curious to know, are you able to integrate with things like Salesforce? What are some of the examples of things that uh, GraphCMS integrates with?
Yeah, exactly. So it right now we have a feature called UI extensions, which actually means that people are able to build their own integrations. depending on their needs and their use case. So we have a couple that we've been working on, but we'll definitely see more of the actual out of the box or plug-in kind of GraphCMS integrations in the future. But as of now, people are able to kind of look at what they need and build it themselves because just GraphCMS is that flexible. Yeah. So let's hear more about Next.js and how they're able to scale with an e-commerce system in particular.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different features that we can use to help us scale or grow our Next.js applications. But I think one particular one that is very important for e-commerce is dynamic routes. So
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to the example that you have for um,
Which example?
the
The here.
GraphCMS example,
Okay.
yeah,
Mm-hmm. This one? Or no, I know. Here
the
we go.
the
There's
e-commerce, yeah,
yes,
cool,
exactly.
awesome. So um, yeah, there, awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we can see here is that we have different products, and if we click on each product, what you will notice is that every single page for that product, the template is exactly the same. So we have a picture, we have a title, we have um, a description, etc. So the only thing that is really changing here is the information that gets displayed, but the template or the layout is the same. So with Next.js, what we can do is we can use dynamic routes to generate pages based on the data that we have. So we can create one template for a product page once, and then generate that page however many number of times necessary. So depending on how big your data is, we can generate one or two or three or hundreds of thousands of product pages, and that's probably like what we would consider a very basic feature of Next.js. But if you think about it, it really does help us save time when it comes to scaling our applications, because we only have to do the work once and then
Mm-hmm.
let the data that we're fetching generate the rest of the pages for us. So I would be curious to know about how do we um, scale data with GraphCMS, especially when we have a lot of products that we want to display and things like that.
Yeah, so a lot of that comes from the way that you've modeled your content. With scaling in GraphCMS, our APIs are super performant in that you're able to store a lot of content within GraphCMS without noticing any sort of um, performance issues or something like that. And by bringing together a couple of different services, whether it be you know a PIM or something else like that, or a payment system, you're able to just aggregate all of that content within GraphCMS, and then keeping your single API endpoint makes it really easy just to be able to move on with the front end and keep all of that stuff optimized on the front end. And of course, there's also caching and that kind of stuff that helps keep everything performant and keep everything that can be cached as possible, as cached as possible, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that
But
makes sense.
one of the things that's important when you're thinking about, especially enterprise systems at scale, is also how are you going to be updating this data? And I've kind of talked about this quite a lot. Of within GraphCMS, you're able to do that manually via the UI, or you're able to do that programmatically. And so that's where, if you're working with an external system as well, and there's changes within your inventory, or you're no longer carrying a product and you want that to be immediately reflected, all of that can be handled programmatically. So there's not a person who has to sit and get a phone call and say, oh, I need to update this. It's automatically done and programmatically done, so that it kind of removes some of that manual friction as well. So updating data is just one of those things that's a key element of also making sure that your end product is performant and that people are having a good user experience as well, especially in the case of e-commerce.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. Very true. Cool. I
Yeah. And thinking about it from a Next.js perspective, I mean, what are some of the things that you guys are doing to make sure that data is always kept um, up to date?
yeah. So we talked about static before, and it you can still use it for product pages, for example, with incremental static regeneration. But for an application that's more complex, like e-commerce, you might want to think more carefully about how you fetch your data, depending on what content you're displaying for your users. So, for example, for the category pages or the gallery, you might want to use server-side rendering to make sure that you're always getting the most up-to-date information, and you can use things like pagination to make sure that the information, um, like the user doesn't see all the information at once, and you can load all the data. But for things that are more dynamic, like for example the user card or your um, user pages or any dashboards that they have access to, you might want to use client-side rendering to make sure that when your user is interacting with your website, they get feedback almost instantly. And with libraries like use SWR, which is also created by the Vercel team, you can do things to make sure that while you're fetching data in the background, the information is updated for the user immediately. Like if the user is mutating your data, you can show that information while you're communicating with GraphCMS, which is can be quite handy,
Yeah,
especially for highly dynamic sites. Um,
definitely.
yeah, so it really does depend again on how much interaction there is on your website. And e-commerce is a perfect example for this because you have static marketing pages and product pages. You might have server-side rendered pages for user information, or you just might opt for client-side rendering for things that need to be updated immediately, like their shopping cart.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are really, you know, it just goes to show how complex of a use case e-commerce is, that you have all of these different types of data interacting in one space. Um, and I think kind of when you're thinking about an e-commerce site, often there's also, you know, seasonal things or seasonal advertisements or kind of promotions that will just go on for a couple of months or something like that. And with GraphCMS, it's really easy to make sure that content is really quick to spin up and to be able to create, but also is able to be quickly changed depending on whether or not the season changes or the time goes by. And so being able to build more flexibility and being able to think about, how an actual user is going to be using this content and what are the different types of ways to ensure that they have a good user experience, I think is really a key thing, and helps e-commerce teams also think about their content in a little bit more of an experimental way. So I know I mentioned this um, with the news example as well, but being able to be really agile and being able to launch promotion quickly without a lot of time, without a lot of developer input is really important to a lot of e-commerce teams. And so being able to run these tests and being able to see how things are working well, um, is really important. And with GraphCMS being able to also bring in data from external services like personalization tools or A/B tests and that sort of thing, being able to bring all of that in the back end is really important as well. And I'd be curious to learn more about Next.js and how they handle some of these testing elements, which are really important to the e-commerce case as well.
Yeah. That's a very good point because you do want to make sure that the content that you're putting out there is having returns. So
Mm.
with Next.js in middleware, which we just announced in our recent conference, you can run A/B tests at the edge
Hmm.
instead of client side, which is how we tend to traditionally do things. And doing A/B testing at the edge does provide a better user experience by reducing some of the things that some of the issues we had with client side, like layout shift or loading times. So from my understanding, the way these two tools would connect is you would create two types of content, right? Are you able to do this on
Yeah,
GraphCMS?
exactly. Yeah, you
Uh-huh.
would have
Yeah.
two different variations of the same
Uh-huh.
content model.
Yes. Yes. So with your content models, you can then pull that data and run your A/B tests with middleware, which I think is probably personally, one of the most exciting features for me when it comes to middleware is that ability to display content and see what's most performant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that our developer who has built the GraphCMS website with Next.js is really excited about this feature, and he's really excited to get his hands on it and give it a go for sure.
Awesome. Let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And
Okay.
then another thing as well, while we're kind of talking about the edge, is
Yeah.
localization, because we
Hmm.
mentioned that we can do this with Graph CMS. So can we just run again on how it actually works with Graph CMS?
Yeah, so with GraphCMS, people are able to, pardon me, people are able to build content models with several locales built into them. So these content models will have the same structure for every locale, but the actual content obviously will be different for each language or yeah, exactly. So you see an example here of how that would look, and people are able to query for a specific language, or again with GraphQL, you don't have to get all of the data. You can pick specific elements depending on what you're actually building. And another cool thing about localization with GraphCMS is that we also have locale-based publishing. So what that means is, if you're working on one new locale and the content's not ready for that new locale, but you want to get the content for an existing locale out the door and published, that you're able to do that, which allows people to work in a more iterative process and kind of allows there always to be new things being released.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about with Next.js. I know that the Edge has a lot of cool functionality with localization, so I'm curious to learn more.
Yes, it does. So one feature that I'm excited about with localization at the edge is power parity pricing, which essentially means that you can check the user's location at the edge, and then you can display a different price depending on where they are. And you can change the price as well. So you mentioned, for example, seasonal discounts. You can also offer discounts depending on the user's location. And we, oh, you're showing the example. We do have those examples on the Vercel website for people to play around with. And it's I think it's going to be a very powerful feature, especially for e-commerce and especially for those who are looking to to grow their audience and go international, because then you can adjust your content depending on where your user is based.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you think of so many different e-commerce examples where you're shipping from other countries, or they have a presence in various countries, and these kind of little things, not having to go and figure out the conversion rate between pounds and euros and that sort of thing. Just these little details make the user experience so much more powerful and exciting.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. Very true. Especially as there's kind of um, this thing in web development that it's really hard to work with currency.
Hmm.
So being able to kind of like abstract some of that, pricing and money and all those little like things that we have to be very mindful of when we're coding with prices, to
Hmm.
be able to abstract some of that to middleware can be quite helpful for us as
Yeah,
developers. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can only imagine as a marketer, I can only imagine how difficult that is. I can't
Yeah,
even think about it
yeah.
that way.
I
But
mean, you
yeah.
have to like you need to make sure you're getting it right because if not, it can be quite hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Oh,
mean, that's one of those things that you don't want to mess up, you
no,
know.
you
It's
don't
like
want. Yeah,
because
you don't want
everyone
to
will
mess
be
up.
angry.
Yes, exactly. You don't want to make people angry.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
This is
Um,
really this was really, really, I think, a really insightful conversation. I've really enjoyed being able to kind of deep dive on these two use cases and learn more about like the nitty gritty features of Next.js and talk a little bit about how those play into GraphCMS as well. Do you have any final thoughts for e-commerce that you want to share about anything that we haven't touched on? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I will probably say there's lots of different features that just can make your application more performant, and Next.js helps with those things. So there isn't a specific feature that I want to talk about, but I would recommend for anyone who's interested to check out our inbuilt components. So we have image, a script, and we also have font optimization, which is really quite helpful when it comes to just building applications in general. And if your website has a lot of scripts or has a lot of images, you want to make sure that you optimize them. Like e-commerce sites tend to have a lot of images. So we do have components that allow you to optimize those elements so that you don't have to worry about um, creating lag or making your websites slower because of these assets. So yeah, I would say definitely check out those Next.js features because they can be quite helpful in instances like this.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about these kind of little elements of Next.js that just, bring the user experience to a whole nother level. And these sound exactly like following that same train of thought. So definitely those sound like a great thing to check out. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time so much for having this conversation and really diving in. Um, for folks who want to give the e-commerce site, the e-commerce starter a go, you can find it on the GraphCMS website. Like I said, it's built with Next.js and GraphCMS, so you can see all of the things that we're talking about, put them into real time, um, and I would say that these two systems are super powerful and they really allow people to build performant applications and performant websites that really show the benefit of using modern frameworks and really demonstrate how important it is to rethink a tech stack and make sure that you're using technology that is not only just what you're comfortable with, but stepping outside of that and using stuff that'll build a modern performance, I think is really, really key.
Hmm. Yes, that's very true. And I also want to say thank you so much for showing me GraphCMS. It's like before we had our initial talks, I hadn't dug deep into the world of headless CMSs. So to be able to learn more about it and see how I can leverage it in the future with my tools is something that's been really great. And I hope that it helps people who are watching us as well to make decisions on what tools to pick for their stack.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's been great to learn more about Next.js as well.
yeah, awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for sticking with us through this whole kind of deep dive into Next.js and GraphCMS and e-commerce and news and content heavy sites. And so we appreciate it. And Delva, it was so great to talk to you.
Likewise, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. All right. And well, this will be it. Nice
Yeah,
to talk to you.
bye. Take care.
Bye.